And takes up, I think, is in the building as well. And 255 business.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'll send it out. Catch up. Are you going to make some time now?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I'll explain what it's about.
Yeah, now I like to use my hands. I've got two.
Alright, guys. Welcome to another SydEduTech meetup, and great to see a big crowd today. We've already reached about 1,200 members now. It's always nice to see 40, 50 people turning up for each of these meetups. Today we've got two amazing speakers, Maria Spies from Navitas and Dan Ingvarson. He's especially here from the US, especially for a short trip, and we're lucky to have him here to speak at this meetup. So without any further delay, I'll probably let Maria start with her talk. It's all about the global landscape of the EdTech, of EdTech, and Dan will probably do a deep dive in the US market.
Thanks. Can everyone hear me through the microphone? Is it on? What about now?
Yes.
Okay, the only reason I'm using a microphone is because they're recording it on video, and somehow it's going to be loaded up into YouTube or something. So
it's in the link after.
It's in the, yeah, so you'll see the presentation after. So that's it's wonderful to be here again. I was here some months ago, maybe a year ago, I can't even remember. It was a while ago when we had launched Navitas Ventures. It was about a day old. Couldn't answer any questions whatsoever, but we're a bit more informed now. And it's wonderful to be here tonight. My name is Maria Spies. I run learning and teaching services at Navitas, and for Navitas Ventures, which is our venturing arm, I run digital learning future, so I look after the sort of pedagogy and learning and teaching side of things, along with other colleagues who are here in the audience tonight as well. Tonight's presentation is going to be around the global EdTech landscape project that we've been undertaking for the last 6 months or so. Navitas, just a little bit firstly about Navitas Ventures. We are, as I said, the venturing arm of Navitas. Navitas being Australia's largest private education provider. We operate in the vocational and higher ed space. In particular, we partner with universities to deliver international students and first-year university to those students, like we do with many other things as well. Navitas, we know though at Navitas, we are like many incumbent large educational organisations. We're part of the old guard, we move fairly slowly, and we know that things are changing. And so Navitas Ventures we started around 6 months ago or more, because we want to make sure that we continue to invest in what will be the education of the future. We invest in education startups, like you guys, if you're a startup, we invest in small and medium size at this point in time education startups. We incubate ideas, so at the moment, for example, we're incubating ideas in English language, we're incubating ideas in blockchain and AI. And also we partner with, whether it be companies or universities, on new ideas and things that we both want to trial, and we partner with those organisations. So it's not just investment, but people mostly focus on investment. Just a little bit about the EdTech investment landscape. You may have seen this. This is from last week. It's an update on EdTech investment globally. And you can see after 3 years of pretty huge growth, we had a bit of a dip in 2016, although in 2015 that was a bit of a spike there, mainly driven by 4 very big investments. And it looks like there's a bit of an upswing back into investment in EdTech. They're predicting nearly $3 billion worth of investment full year projection for 2017. So we're back in a bit of an upswing after a little bit of a dip last year. The good news for all of you early stage startups is that the vast majority of investment is in that very early stage, whether it be right down in seed or round A series. Over 50%, 60% in most cases across, and that hasn't really changed too much. So that's fantastic. People are investing in early stage startups in EdTech. It's wonderful. However, I guess the sort of caveat to that is most of the actual dollars, the big dollars, are in the later stage. That's where the big money is. So that's just a bit of an overview of investment in EdTech over the last 5 or so years. Navitas, in our ventures capacity, we're looking at the very complex landscape of EdTech and startups and innovation in education. And there are many, many different ways to cut that pie. It's not hard to find a lot of information. In fact, that's the problem. There's a lot of information around. But how do you make sense of that, especially if you're trying to invest in that? And so we started a project some months ago to map the EdTech landscape. We wanted to find out, you know, where are all the EdTech companies? What are they focusing on? Are they focusing on tools in the classroom? Are they focusing on credentialing? What's happening at early stage, mid stage, and late stage? And how is that landscape changing? And so we launched this project. We partnered with a company called Quid, which is a data visualization company, and we mapped this landscape 2.0. There was early 1.0, but 2.0 maps 5,000 EdTech companies globally, and then puts them into 23 clusters. And I'm just going to show you, this is the tool, it's a video of the tool clustering those companies. So each of those dots is a company, an EdTech startup or a startup company in education. And they are clustered based on the Quid data, the Quid database, Quid system analyzes text of the companies. So it looks at the text of the websites of the companies, and based on the analysis of that text clusters them into certain areas of like. So for example, it's a bit hard to read there, but say the bottom green cluster down here is social platforms. So there's quite a lot of activity down there. Each dot is a company, and the closer they are together, the more alike they are. And so you can see some clusters are very close. So over on the right-hand side there, the student financing, the light blue one, there's a whole sort of cluster there that are very similar, and then a bunch that move back into platforms, because probably they're not only student financing, but have some properties of platforms as well. And so you can see the size and shape of these. It's important. The shape of it is important, not just the number of them. The location of it is important as well. And so we have undertaken this sort of mapping, 5,000 companies. Our next Landscape 3.0 is due out in August or September, and we hope to have many, many more. I think we're looking at 30,000 companies because we're trying to map those globally. What you mostly see in maps of EdTech is lots and lots of logos of companies, and mostly also they're just limited to what the investment bank has invested in rather than the landscape. So we're trying to map the whole landscape. I know it's pretty ambitious, but we've got a plan. So 23 clusters of like, which then turned into, we put them into 8 steps. Those 23 clusters into 8 steps. We decided in the end to manage those steps around the student life cycle. The first 2 on the left-hand side are create and manage. That's from the provider's point of view, if you want to call it that. So in terms of create, that's content creation. So all you publish, digital courseware, etc., are all in those in that phase. The manage step, as you can see, is also fairly huge. That's where EdTech, sort of education management systems are. Anything to do with assisting organisations managing the education process, if you like. Huge, massive area. The rest of those, starting with discover, is the student life cycle. So discovering, finding, locating, and getting into education. So again, lots and lots of activity in that space. Student financing also sits in there, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. Connecting students, connecting teachers, connecting peers, learning management systems, and anything to do with connecting students and learning and teachers and so on. Oops, let's go back. Oh. Right. Experience, so what happens in the classroom, whether it be virtual or physical, VR and AR, new robotics, new, there's lots of activity in this space with 622 companies of the 1,000, so just over 12% or something like, of the 5,000 companies. Learn is all the companies who actually, or organisations who deliver learning. So that would be all the MOOC providers. If we're talking about new innovative companies, if this was a map of the existing sort of landscape, all universities would be in that learn bucket. That's what they do. And open online language courses and so on and so on. Credentialing, relatively small, with 266 companies and only $2.1 billion worth of investment, but that actually is growing at a pace. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. Testing and assessment also has been big for a very long time, but badging and credentialing is getting bigger as we go along. And then the advanced bucket, which is those startups or those companies who are helping learners get jobs. Again, something that's very hot right now. Just in terms of the life cycle, the heat map of investment, all this information, by the way, is available on our website, but the heat map of investment, it's not surprising, I guess, to see that big number of companies and investment in the learn bucket. That is the biggest area. That is where the delivery occurs. But I think what's going to be important over the next few years as this landscape evolves is how this pattern changes in terms of where the growth is in the new activity in terms of investment and also the number of companies. And I've got to say, nothing is exact. So these buckets or phases look like they're sort of separate, but actually there's lots of companies who fit into multiple places. And so we'll see that sort of change as we go along as well. Just a little bit about trends that we're seeing, with a caveat, and I'll talk about that on the next slide, but there is a caveat. So what we're finding as we do all this analysis and so on, talk to lots of startups and ecosystems like this ecosystem in different cities around the world, we do see sort of there's alternative delivery models, as you know, but they are themselves evolving now. And so there's lots of experimentation, and in particular, alternative models are now, rather than just competition to existing models, starting to collaborate. So partnerships between boot camps and universities, for example. So there's a bit of that. So that's interesting. We'll see where that goes and how that goes. Education to work, the boundary between formal education and work is just really sort of breaking down as far as I know. As far as I can see, there is definitely a convergence of EdTech and what they call talent tech now. And so we see a lot of activity in that space, definitely. Lots of startups trying to crack the difficult to scale problem of getting not just university students, but getting people jobs or getting people internships or getting people experience. And so the first two are a little bit related because a lot of those alternative models actually are sort of, you know, they talk about themselves as a lifelong skills development models. So education to work, lots of investment going into that space. That's the sort of advanced space in our sort of terminology. Alternative credentialing, it's been around for a little while. It continues on. There's not a huge number at this point in time, but growing. And again, once you have alternative models and once you have people who are really interested in continuing learning, they want that credential. And it's not through a university anymore. And so what are the other models? It's becoming more and more important. And blockchain is sort of entering into that space, still early phases, but blockchain on the surface seems like a really good idea in terms of alternative credentialing. We'll see how that goes. Constrained public funding in education is massive, and student financing. There's quite a few student financing startups coming along right now, and different models as well. There's a couple of models there in these examples where you don't pay for the education, but they take a piece of equity of your future income, which I think is really neat, right? A bit of a risk, but you know, we'll see how that goes as well. Continuing on, this is not new, but you know, the one size fits one. It's about the learner, it's their journey, it's personal, so it's not a sort of standardized model anymore. Lots of gamification, AI, VR, AR, etc., adaptive systems, and so on. That continues. That's not stopping. Much more now in the higher ed as well as the K-12 space. Tackling complex learning problems. I was recently in Salt Lake City for the the ASU GSV conference and met quite a number of startups who are trying to use machine learning in particular to tackle quite complex learning problems, which to date have only been tackled by human. You know, how do you really assess critical thinking at scale? That's tough, actually. But some of these startups are doing an incredible job. They've got big ideas. They're going to tackle this, and so that's either very scary or really exciting, depending on which side of the fence you sit. And so that's sort of some of the trends we're seeing, with a big asterisk at the end, because I thought long and hard about what to show on the slide, as if that's the only thing that's happening. That's not the only thing that's happening. The big thing, test prep, massive, huge, still huge. Tutoring, also massive. We see big, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of investment in this space. Language learning, still massive and growing. And just China, everything to do with China, also very big. So they're huge. So I felt like I needed to say something about those. One of the things I'd like to ask you as founders or people who are working in startups, what we're trying to do is get everybody into this landscape. We want your startups in that landscape. And to do this, we've got a global EdTech census. It looks like we're going to have 20 or 30,000 respondents into this census. We've got people all around the world. Our company is global, and we have Navitas Ventures scouts located in 50 countries, and they are connecting with ecosystems just like this one to get the startups to enter into the census. And we would love for you to be in there and provide you with information about who else is operating in your part of the landscape. So I was talking to someone earlier who's in a particular startup. They love to find out and meet with others who are doing similar things. I mean, you would never know, you would never be able to meet with them. This is actually a way that we can start connecting that global community. So I'd love for everyone to be part of this. It's in languages. It's 10 questions. It literally takes 2 minutes. So you can get your phones out now or maybe later, and entering the census. That would be great. I've got some cards there as well you can take away, but please be part of it. And we'll be, obviously, if you're part of it, you can get early access to data. So that's my call for audience participation. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Maria. Just hold off your questions for now. Let's have Dan on the panel, and then we bring both of you again in a panel and then ask questions to both of you.
Thank you. I don't have a wonderful PowerPoint, Maria, but I did notice that there are a lot of common things that you were talking about there. So I have a slightly different place that I'm coming from. I was just popping through town, and Riley said, "Can you come and just sit on a panel and have a quick chat about what you've been doing?" So first of all, how many people here are actually part of a startup? Wow, that's fantastic. And how many are in K-12 space with a small number? There's one down the back that we've got to watch out for. And how many of you are from sort of the higher ed vocational space? So, thank you. So, I'm more of involved in the K-12 particular space, and work in the United States. I'm part of an incubator called SydEd. I have my own little startup that's part of that group, and it was partnerships going on between universities and things like that and other models, and this is and do a of those, bring people together internationally. So we find often doing webinars with countries and European companies and who are interested in one another. So started really is a community rather than it being a particular kind of accelerator program itself right now. It becomes an accelerator program for 3 months of the year, and the rest of the year is. Now, coming into the US, there is some cultural differences. How many people have spent a fair bit of time in the US? You've got to think. Yeah. So you know that sometimes when you're talking to, how are you doing? When you're talking to somebody from the United States, you show them amazing, wonderful. You know, I somebody say, oh, God, I've got a sale. I've got, you know, I've got a penny. Beware of the over-enthusiastic, a lot more honest in terms of the way that we give you feedback. They don't like to give negative feedback. There is at least 4 different kind of markets within the United States. Structurally, particularly in the K-12 sector, the South Texan kind of structure of market is much more dominated by decision makers that push decisions out. There's a bit more autocratic. The Northeast is the sort of liberal centre. They tend to take a very long time to make decisions. The Midwest is, surprisingly, what I've found is that they are the most likely to make decisions quickly and individually. And we find that that's where, when we're going direct to teachers, we get people literally just delving into their own pockets. Teachers going and buying the products based out of their own pockets. I have a whole heap of notes here. I'm trying to do off the back of them. I did get up at 4:30 this morning. I'm sorry, I was slightly jet lagged.
Was that 4th region?
That's the fourth region. The 4th region is California and the West. And for startups, that's where we all think we should be. You know, and you get crazy multiples. But my experience with people who've been over there, and particularly from the Australian businesses, there's a number that have tried to crack into that. It's surprisingly difficult. However, I found that the New York market is more, it's slower, but it's more able, it's more accessible. People will actually come back to you in that regard. Okay, so a little bit of the stats. The K-12 market in the US is $1.2 trillion, and there's not a spare dollar left. They come out. You can go into the market, as we know, as a B2B play, or which is a very useful play if you've got relationships with state governments or with big professional networks. If you can get in through those other professional networks, that's a decent way to go into the US market. But if you're needing to show traction quickly, that's obviously a slower kind of sales cycle. The B2T market, B2T, is a much easier market to show some immediate traction. That's teachers, and that's because there's a culture that's different between Australia and the United States. In Australia, teachers don't tend to spend money out of their own pocket, whereas the US, $500 or so a year is what teachers will be spending out of their own pockets on stuff for their classrooms. that's how Edmodo, it's how Newzella, it's how a range of other players got their starts to prove traction, to create a low-cost B2T play. And there's a lot of content plays that are using the B to T to C model, which is to provide free value to teachers on the back of trying to charge parents. And there's some examples of that in Australia as well, like Study Ladder, things like that. All right. So some of the other things that are going on in the market. I noticed the evolving schools. It's a really interesting, big, long-term trend to think about. These alt schools that are being put together are creating a set of platforms where they're looking at how learning is happening in a way that Facebook funds. There's a lot of data that's being put into these systems, and they're actually looking at how to scaffold project-based learning. Which, if we can do that, there's a really interesting trend that can happen out of that. Because we don't have any of the administrative systems to do that kind of stuff now. Our administrative systems are about structure that is timetabled, that is graded, that it gives you the year-based references on learning. And what's coming out of these alt schools, there's some pretty amazing ideas. We'll see whether AI or other things like that are going to be able to draw this thing together on how you can scaffold collaboration, how you can scaffold those things and still make assessments. One of the other big assessment things, the changes that's happening is assessment for learning, not assessment of learning. If you've got anything that can give feedback quickly to a teacher, that can give feedback quickly to a parent on how the student's going, that gets people's attention. You don't want to be at the end of the cycle. That's one of the big things that's happening in classrooms. But as is always the case, if you're going to get into a classroom, time is the biggest, most expensive thing. If you cost a teacher 15 minutes, you've got to be giving them a lot of value. So if you can save them 15 minutes, then they make you your friend. So you've got to find a way to save teachers' time if you're going to have a model that goes into classrooms. And that has been the way for a long time, but it's getting more and more important, which is why some of these other tools are rising. Do people know things like Newzella or Newzella? No? It's a reading, it's a social studies platform, really, where kids have to read an article, and the article they can put the article at a grade 3 level, grade 4 level, or grade 5 level. The article is the same. It's a relevant article reasonably, and then they get to answer questions on it. Now, what's this replaced, and why do teachers reach into their pockets and pay $120 a year for it? It's taken all of the worksheets that they have to do for homework, and it's got them graded so that they've got kids at the higher, medium, and lower levels, and it gives them answers back where they're not having to do work. And now Newzella is going to be huge because all of the actual districts are taking it up. It's not the teachers. The teachers have what they call it landed and expanded is the sales strategy. Go in through there, and then you go up to the school and up to the districts. And so the teachers then advocate to the districts to purchase it, and that's one of an example of a product that's doing that perfectly. They've taken away the administrative problems for the teacher. taking away some of the marking problems for the teacher, and giving them value.
How do you spell it then?
News, LEA.
Thanks.
We talked about project-based learning, and you talked about badges, and that competency-based learning is an area that's emerging. Like with anything in startups, you want to be in those emerging particular areas, not taking on incumbents if you can at all help it. There's a huge trend. This was a real eye-opener for me getting into the US market, that teachers are banding together to work with teachers online themselves. There are now these Facebook groups that are closed Facebook groups that you have to pay. You pay $150 to join a Facebook group that you talk about teaching in. But they got these materials that they all share amongst each other and get sets of curated materials. And it's one of the ones that's worth looking up is the 40-hour teaching week. It's called something 40-hour. Basically, they're teachers helping each other to get the materials, so they're not having to spend 60 hours a week working. And they're doing this now as completely outside of professional development, which is a huge market. And so there's some trend going on here that teachers are helping one another. The other thing is star teachers, that you're seeing these huge celebrities coming out that are creating their own jobs and profiles by trying to translate good teaching practice across, and really being celebrities in the process of doing it. Data privacy is still a major issue. It's not going to be going away, so if you're ever going to enter the US market, make sure that you know how to salt your hashes. If you don't know what that is, you probably should at some stage. There is another trend that's going on, which is digital ecosystems. So the discussion is now getting to a point, this is off the back of data privacy, where what we need to be able to do is send data to one of the startups or one of the vendors from the district, from the school, such that we know who you are, your name, your email, that kind of thing, to create accounts automatically for you. They call it rostering in the US. And there are data standards now that people are asking you to do that rostering. But it's going through the next phase, which they're asking for data back. So this digital ecosystem of single sign-on, of getting data in and getting data out, is another trend that is occurring. And finally, if you're going into the US market, don't try and do it alone. There are actually a lot of businesses in Australia that are connected to the people like in Victoria, it's Invest Victoria, I don't know who it is in, in New South Wales, but that have relationships, Austrade, that have relationships with players. I've seen players that come over, they go to a conference, and there's a huge conference, and they're like, how do I speak to anyone? And there are actually professional, paid-for people who will introduce you to districts. It's a highly commercialised market in a way that we don't get in Australia. You can buy 400,000 teachers' emails, and they'll tell you whether they're grade 1 or year 7 or this or English teacher or that, and they've got all of this demographic information about them. You can actually go and directly do that kind of stuff. And sort of, well, like here in Australia, that would be considered really kind of pretty invasive. But in the US, it's kind of okay. And they've got these people who will help, they'll charge you, but they'll charge you a lot less than you having to put your own staff on the ground and learn how to get into the market themselves. And if you're trying to get into New York, come contact me. Thank you.
Maria. I'll open it up to the audience. Questions? Any questions for Dan and Maria?
Come on, someone's going to have a question. Oh, there you go.
Yeah, I'm fascinated with the notion of, fascinated, excited about the economic potential of selling to teachers and then going up. You call it some special words, I don't know what it was.
Land and expand.
Land expand, that sounds really cool. So I've got a product and I want to land and expand. I know it'll work, but I need someone to polish it into that US market. How do I find someone who can speak American for me to help me do that?
So that's precisely what I was talking about. With Austrade, they have people who are specialists in education. Now, are you higher ed, K-12?
I'm going to say something dangerous. I go through from about year 10, 10-year-old, through to 90.
Okay.
But I can niche whichever one you want. You know, go year 10 if you want.
I would say this is one other thing about the US market. If you, in Australia, we're generalists because we have to be because there's not many of us, kind of stuff. So you can cover a big space. In the US, unless you are really specific and highly being able to say, I can beat you in 9.5-year-olds. You've got to be kind of really specific. So I'll be saying.
The best market in there?
Well, I think higher ed is a particular kind of enterprise market. It's very much an enterprise market. K-12 has the aspect of being both a consumer market and a business-to-business market. Except if you, well, higher ed, I should say you've got the students, which is the consumer model, in there. But if you're talking about the institutions, that is. So I would be talking to Austrade, and I can also help you. There literally are people who will say to you, sell me your product, and then they'll say, I don't think that's got to fit in the US market, or you need to fit, polish it up and that kind of thing, and they'll charge you to do that. Yeah.
Briefly, you sort of mentioned single sign-on very briefly. How important is it to be able to link into a system where the students can actually put a system where students log in and create? How important is it for them to be able to do a single sign-on to be able to access your product?
It's becoming more and more important. Have you heard of a company called Clever?
No.
I'd have a look at Clever. They are a commercial play to make it easy for you to do that, and they'll charge you $200 a site for the privilege. So there's a huge backlash against them, but what they've done is they've shifted the expectations of the schools and the teachers, because they don't charge the teachers. It's free for the districts. They charge the vendors per building. And you can still get away with it now, but with what I do, there are districts who just say, unless you go and give a single sign-on, and that we're not playing. And 2 years ago, that wasn't happening. It's still in a small percentage, but it's a trend that's coming. Aaron.
Just a question on the census. Two questions actually. One, is there scope for really clear data in certain markets, like the Aussie market or the UK market? The second question is, what out of the trends, what are the markets that you're really excited about, the national markets that are popping up?
Okay, so just for the recording, 2 questions about the census. Data in terms of particular markets. So will there be data? Yes, there will, because when you complete it, we know who you are, where you're from, and so on. And so we want to feed that back to participants of the census. We want to make sure that we can slice that data by geography, by sector, by type of startup, what they're trying to solve, etc. So yes, that data will be available. And the second one was, sorry.
Nations that are kind of surprising you guys, that are doing some interesting things? Are you seeing any, like, is Israel or other countries are popping up that are doing really interesting?
Yeah, I mean, look, there is a fairly robust EdTech market in many countries, right? And we don't know them all, so that's a bit hard. But obviously, like I said before, China is huge. China is going from an imitator to an innovator, and that's a big trend because once that happens and takes off, it's all bets are off in a way. There's some really interesting stuff. Definitely, Israel is very strong in startups and technology generally. Singapore also is relatively small, but lots and lots of government funding there, like in many Asian countries, or developed Asian countries. And South America as well, fairly sort of robust sort of ecosystems there. Probably many more, but they're off the top of my head. Yeah.
You spoke about a degree of activity in acquiring small EdTech players. Was early stage, investment in early stage.
Yes. Yeah.
Have you done any research on who's actually carrying out the investors? Are they large EdTech specialists or are they education providers who are investing? Is there any trends or any information you can give on that?
Very large venture capital firms who do specialise in education. They often take out the big chunks, the big dollars. I'm not sure how many average current incumbent sort of education providers also invest in startups. Navitas is one of them, but I don't know how many players do that. Yeah.
There is a well-formed EdTech angels sets of groups in the East and West Coast, based in New York, Boston, and California. That's a reasonably solid place. But then you've got the next group that are creating seed rounds now, like Rethink Education. We met when we were in New York. They were there. They're really. They used to write $500,000 checks for Series A kind of rounds, and they're moving back down the chain. I think it's because a number of the spaces that were available 4 years ago, for new innovation in education is closing up, and it's harder to find people who are getting above that threshold line, and so the investors are having to move down the value chain in order to find the potentials that are coming there, which just means that there's smaller amounts, bigger risks that we take. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with that in terms of, lots more activity down in that very early stages because, you saw that chart of investment from 2013 or 12, lots and lots of hyped investment. And so the price of things went really high for the returns. And so many people got squeezed out of that market. So they're starting to sort of fish down into the very early stage and take more smaller bets. Because obviously it's if they've got limited funds, yeah. So.
It's also that in some of the markets there is not a lot of free dollars that are flowing around. So I'm seeing more plays into the consumer space, particularly like linking universities and jobs, linking students and loans. It's some aspect of the business has a consumer play to it rather than more of those big investments which are institutional plays like learning management systems and big AI systems and that kind of thing.
Then you mentioned in relation to single sign-on that some groups were asking for the data back.
Yes.
What group did you make?
So we're seeing data warehousing going increasing, at large districts and state levels. I think that's happening a little bit around Australia as well. There's a couple of people, who are actually beginning to articulate that we own some of the data that that the students in my institution are going into your system and generating a whole lot of value for you, and I'm not seeing that data. I'm supposed to look after those kids. I'd like a copy of that, please. The data standards aren't up to it, though. I know that if you want to see one of the districts that's doing a good job, it's District 87 or Illini Cloud. If you look up them, they're taking quite a number of different feeds of information. Houston ISD, they are using a range of standards to bring back specifically grades from a lot of different systems, and dumbed it down so that they're able to aggregate that into more of a spreadsheet model. But at least they're doing it from a range of players, even though really we know that that's not where the richness of the data is. There's a standard called Caliper, and that's a learning analytics standard. You won't have to implement it because it's quite complex, but just to think about it as we would think about Google Analytics and all of that information that goes on with what people do online. This Caliper standard is trying to say everybody who does learning systems out there, like content or assessments, all of these different types, now can funnel information back to what they're calling a learning resource store, which is just basically a great big database where every single thing you do at all gets pushed into this database. Every time you turn a page in an electronic textbook, every single thing is being pushed back via this Caliper standard so that they can start to do a learning analytics. What I really enjoy about the learning analytics that they did was they found a single data point that was able to be the best predictor of whether you were going to finish a university course or not. Anyone have a guess at what that was? No?
Units of alcohol.
It turns out that if you open your electric e-textbook before the start date of the course, that's the highest ask-word predictor of whether you're going to complete the course or not. Out of all of that learning analytics, out of everything they've got, that was the biggest one.
Any more questions?
It's sort of related to that. So you had a slide earlier about trends,
Yeah.
and I understood most of them. So evolving alternative models, education to work, alternative credentialing, funding education, one size fits one, which is about AR, VR, and all the rest of it. And then you have one at the bottom, which is tackling complex learning problems. Yeah. And you talked about to solve the complex learning activities, such as critical thinking and group work. Sorry, what's there to solve there? Aren't you supposed to help the students with that sort of? I mean, shouldn't you be making a system that helps them do that, which is what the LMS and everything else has done? And the social media platform and the rest of it. So,
Yeah, well, one might argue that a learning management system can't help solve critical thinking problems.
no, that's right.
Right, so these systems that I was seeing in my recent trip were systems which were designed to help students and teachers learn and solve critical thinking problems. So assessing critical thinking, which is actually very complex, and usually it's not a machine, what I guess what the trend is that all those basic problems, the if this then that, oh, they got that wrong, they go over here, they got that wrong, they go over here, they got that right, move to bed. I mean, all that basic stuff, that's all been sort of scooped up already. Now they're using this machine learning and AI and so on to try to solve really quite complex problems for students that usually are marked by or assessed by humans. That's what I was trying to say. And I mean, things that are up until now have been very difficult to scale. And so it'll be fascinating to see if they can crack those sorts of things.
Is Navitas talking to authors?
Navitas talking to many startups, including authors, yes.
What are some of the opposite trends, things that you're seeing disappearing, that people are still engaging with? You know what I mean? Like there's trends that are coming up in the future, but there's things where people are still engaging with it now, but you can start to see that they're going to be things that don't invest there.
Oh, don't invest there. Well,
Things that people were talking about.
Learning
now.
management system.
Yeah,
except, since 2000, the top 10 VC-backed startups or investments in the last 10 years are all learning management systems. So let's not throw that away yet. But yeah, there's challenges there, I think. I think part of it is it's when not to invest is hard, because it depends on, if you're investing in something, it depends on what your focus is, where you can add value, the area that you're, the size of investment, the location. It really depends on the fund, if you want, your thesis around investment. So a bit too hard to answer that question. But there are some areas that are very full already, and unless you've got, $50 million in the back pocket, then it's too late in a way. So
A maths app.
yeah, there's some things that are
Another.
that are done, to death, I guess. But
All right. Thanks, Maria. And they'll still hang around, so if you have more questions, please feel free to contact.
Let's do a quick sales pitch, guys. We do have teachers in Australia who put their hands in their pockets as well and paid $500. We've got about 2,000 coming to an event in September in Melbourne called EdUchange. EdUchange.com.au. There's space for startups to exhibit. The day before is an event called Edupreneurs. About 200 or 300 entrepreneurs and investors coming together for a day of learning and ideas and stuff. So educhange.com.au/edupreneur for that startup event. If you want any information, let me know. Thanks.
I don't know if how many people have seen this How 5 people can be behind that you can't do this. I've been talking about AI, VR, stuff like that.